First of all, I want to thank Mike and Evelina for hosting the event and for being such great friends, and all the other hosts, and particularly the Nalbajans, who, you know, Janet has been my partner for many, many years during COVID and on the issues affecting child health. And we've become very close, and I'm very grateful for her support of me in this, not only in this presidential campaign, but at Children's Health Defense. I also am very grateful and honored and touched by the willingness of the Archbishop to host this event, and I'm grateful for the prayer that he treated us to at the beginning of this. I rely a lot on prayer, and I feel very good about the fact that I'm getting it from many, many people around our country. And so, Archbishop, thank you very much for adding your voice to that. I want to also just talk about the personal connection that I have to Armenia. For those of you who are Armenian in here, I went to high school in Watertown, New York, and I had an Armenian girlfriend. It was very, very beautiful and very smart. And I was surrounded by Armenian people. Watertown, Massachusetts, for those of you who don't know, was one of the big receiving areas after the genocide. And my girlfriend's family had come over in the genocide, so I was steeped in what happened during the Armenian genocide throughout all my high school years. And Watertown, New York Watertown, Massachusetts is the third biggest Armenian community in this country after Los Angeles and after Fresno, California. And I think Glendale is probably one of the biggest kind of, yeah, number one. All right, number one. We were number three. So I got used to Armenian food, and I got used to hearing the stories about the tragedy, the personal tragedy that almost everybody that I met in Watertown was a refugee from, and that our country had been a place of safety. And I think it's really, one of the things that I won't forget as President of the United States is the struggle of Armenians for sovereignty, for dignity, for their right to reunify their country, including Artsakh, which has been since 200 BC, has been the birthplace of the Armenian people. And the fact that the world didn't notice this racial ethnic cleansing, this genocide, is really striking to me. But it's something that I intend to talk about and to continue talking about, and to use my power as President of the United States to leverage the cooperation of nations within that region to do everything I can to peacefully reunite Armenia. I'll talk for just a second about my polling numbers, because during the reception, a number of you asked me about my numbers. And there have been 3 large gold standard polls that came out recently: the Quinnipiac poll, the Harvard-Harris poll, and the New York Times Siena poll. And those show me, number one, with the highest support, beating both President Trump and President Biden, in all Americans under 45 years old. So this is a bellwether group of people, voters, and it's 10 months before the election. I'm also beating President Biden and President Trump decisively among the independent voters. And I'm in the 5 battleground states. I go from 22 to 27% in Michigan. And my average is 24%. And all it takes for me to win the presidency is 34%, because the Electoral College is winner take all. So theoretically, if I had 34% and my opponents both had 33%, I would win the presidency. I think I'm going to do a lot better than 34%, but I have 10 months, and all I need is to take 4.5 percentage points away from each of the other candidates, and I win the election. My favorability rating numbers are the best. So I'm at 52%. The net favorability, where they compare unfavorable to favorable, I'm 25 points over water. I'm the only figure that they polled that has anything close to that. And this includes not just all the political leaders in our country, but also celebrities like Elon Musk and others. And President Trump is 7 points, so I'm 25 points over water. President Trump is 7 points over, and President Biden is 2 points underwater. And that bodes well for me in the election, but also if this goes to a contingent election, which is if none of the three candidates get 270 electoral college votes, the contest then is decided by the Senate, decides the vice president, the House decides the president, with each state getting one vote. And normally you would think that would give it to President Trump, but it's not so. The problem that they have is that neither of them have enough to get to 26, which they need. They need 26 votes under the Constitution. And they need 26 states supporting them, and it's highly likely, and no Trump supporter is going to switch in Congress is going to switch their vote to Biden. No Biden supporter in Congress is going to switch their vote to Trump. And so they're going to have to almost certainly go to a compromise candidate. And I would say that is, I'm going to apply for that job. I'm going to be very brief and not make a long speech, but the thing that I've tried, I'm going to answer your questions. The thing that I promised to do 8 months ago when I made my announcement in Boston was to not feed into the vitriol, the anger, the polarization that I believe is poisoning our country. And so you won't hear me making personal criticisms of President Trump or President Biden. What I said that I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the values that we all share in common, Republicans, Democrats, and Independents, rather than focus on the divisive culture war issues that keep us all at each other's throats. And of course, we're seeing now this shift in wealth upward in our country, away from small business, away from the middle class, away from Main Street. And during COVID pandemic, in 500 days, President Biden and President Trump created 500 new billionaires, and a billionaire a day, and shifted $4.4 trillion from the American middle class to this new oligarchy of super rich. And we closed 3.3 million businesses with no due process, no just compensation, no scientific citation, no public hearings, and many of those businesses will never reopen. 41% of Black-owned businesses will never reopen, and many of those businesses had 3 generations of equity in them. And we've seen now these corporations that control our government. I'm all for corporations and all for business and entrepreneurship, but I don't believe that corporations should control our government. And what we're seeing is these giant behemoths like BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. Those three companies own 89% of the S&P 500. They're now buying the farmland and the land in this country, so our children cannot afford houses because the giant corporations are going in and buying single-family homes and residential homes. And we're going from an ownership society to a rental society. And that's not good for democracy, and it's not good for our economy. I was raised during a period when my uncle was president, the 50 years after World War II, when the American middle class became the greatest economic engine in the history of mankind. We were the richest. When my uncle was president, I was 10 years old. We had half the wealth on the face of the earth in this country. We were the biggest exporter of goods. We were an industrial behemoth, and part of that was because we had obliterated the industrial base of Europe during World War II, and our industrial base was up and running. But most importantly, we put middle-class people in this country, we put almost every American family that wanted it into a home. We did that with the GI Bill, with a lot of other legislation, with the highway program that made rural land cheap and suburban land cheap. And that interest, that possession by all of these regular Americans who have homes, it made them care more about their communities. If you own a home, you care about your police, you go to the PTA meetings, you care about your schools, you care about your health care, and you care about your neighbors. But more importantly, you have an entree to the capitalist system. If you own a home, you can borrow money. You have equity. And if you have an entrepreneurial impulse, you can pursue that impulse. And that's how we created this explosion of wealth in this country, this ferment of entrepreneurial development, what Franklin Roosevelt calls America's industrial genius. And today we're going the opposite direction. We're taking the homes away from Americans. Our kids cannot afford homes. I have 7 children. One of them, who's 39, is in the home. The rest of them are in their 30s. And none of them has a hope of getting in a home. And this is going to damage our economy, and ultimately it will damage our democracy as well. And one of the things that I'm going to do as president is to make sure that this generation of kids, our children, can afford to go into homes. And I'm going to do that by removing a lot of the tax incentives that make home ownership by large investment firms so profitable today. When I go around the country, and when I stay away from these issues that are used to divide us, you know, when the king and queen go out on the balustrades of their castle and they see all their subjects fighting each other, they go back to the banquet hall and they pop champagne corks because they know nobody is coming over the wall to get them and to take back what they've stolen. And what I promise to do over the next 8 months of this campaign, or 10 months of this campaign, and during the 8 years of my presidency, is to end the vitriol, to dampen the vitriol, the polarization, the hatred, the poison, and lead Americans over the wall and take back our country from the people who have strip mined the wealth from our middle class and our young. And what I found in focusing on those unifying issues, I found that the landscapes of the issues that unify us are so much larger than the tiny little landscapes of the issues that divide us, you know, guns, abortion, the border, etc. Those are important issues. But the issues that bring us together are much, much bigger. Everybody wants to support our veterans. Nobody likes it, the fact that the wives and families of veterans today are eating in soup kitchens. Everybody wants us to once again have the best education system in the world. Everybody wants to make sure the border is not being run, and immigration is not being run by Mexican drug cartels. We can seal the border, and we can have broad gates for legal immigrants to come into this country, and so that we have control over who comes in. And make sure that there are people who are legal and that are benefiting our economy. Everybody wants a clean environment. If you want to divide people, talk about climate change. If you want to bring people together, talk about pollution and about the destruction of our landscapes, our Purple Mountain Majesty. There's no such thing as Republican children or Democratic children when it comes to the environment. Everybody who needs clean air, everybody needs clean water. Everybody understands that our landscapes, the rivers, the fisheries, the shoreline, the Purple Mountains Majesty, that those are the infrastructures of our community. And that if we want to meet our obligation as a generation, as a civilization, as a nation, which is to create communities for our children that provide them with the same opportunities for dignity and enrichment and prosperity and good health as our parents gave us, we've got to start by protecting our environmental infrastructure, our air, water, wildlife, fisheries, public lands. These are the assets that connect us to our past, to our history, that give context to our communities, that are the source, ultimately, of our values, our virtues, our character as a people. And these are the ways that creation is the way that we talk most articulately and eloquently, that God talks to us. God talks to human beings through many vectors, through each other, through organized religion, through the great books of those religions, through wise people like the Archbishop, and through art and literature and music and poetry, but nowhere with such texture and grace and color and joy as through creation. And when we destroy our environment, we destroy part of our capacity to sense the divine, to understand who God is and what our own potential is as human beings. Everybody wants to end the chronic disease epidemic in this country. When my uncle was president, 6% of Americans had chronic disease. What are those? Obesity, neurological diseases like ADD, ADHD, speech delay, language delay, tics, Tourette's syndrome, ASD, autism, the autoimmune diseases that exploded. We've gone in autism, we've gone from 1 in 10,000 in my generation, 69-year-old men today, 1 in 10,000 of people my age have autism. 1 in 34 of our children. Something happened. And nobody's asking that question. And it's devastating us. The autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, juvenile diabetes that I never saw. I had 11 siblings and 70 first cousins. I never saw anybody with juvenile diabetes or food allergies. Peanut allergies, why do 5 of my kids have allergies? They were unknown in my generation. And nobody's asking that question. And we had, during COVID, we had the highest death rate in the world. So we had, in this country, 16% of the COVID deaths. And we only have 4.2% of the population, the world's population. We have the worst body count of any country in the world. Why is that? One was mismanagement. The other reason is we have the highest chronic disease burden in the world. We have the sickest children on earth today. We spend more on healthcare 3 or 4 times what anybody does in Europe. And yet we have the worst health outcomes. We're 79th in health outcomes after Mongolia, Nicaragua, Costa Rica. And we were told by the CDC, the average person who died from COVID had 3.8 chronic diseases. So they had obesity, asthma, allergies or anaphylaxis, and something else. And because we had the sickest children, the sickest people in the world, we had the highest COVID death rates. So we need to fix that, and I'm going to fix that when I get into office. Everybody wants to unravel the war machine. We've spent $8 trillion on wars over the past 20 years and got nothing for it. And it's bankrupted our middle class in this country, and it's hurting our country. We need to protect ourselves at home, but to spend that money rebuilding our industrial base, educating our children so they're the best educated. And everybody wants to end the corrupt merger of state and corporate power. That's destroying our public function and destroying the faith that our country has in its democratic institutions. And I feel I'm in the best position to do that. All of the government agencies, I've sued almost every one of them. And when I've sued EPA probably 30 or 40 times, I've sued CDC, NIH, FDA, the USDA, I'm representing 1,000 families in East Palestine, Ohio right now, whose lives were upended by the Norfolk Southern spill, which happened because Norfolk Southern controls DOT. So it didn't have the proper heat sensors on the wheels of its train that would have stopped that. And, I've sued the FCC and successfully. I won a case in the Federal Court of Appeals about 6 months ago for lying to the American public about the safety of cell phone radiation. And on, and when you sue these agencies, you get a PhD in corporate capture and how to unravel it. And I know how to do that, how to end the perverse incentives that put corporate capture on steroids. In many of these agencies, I know the people who have to be moved out in order to change the culture of the agency so that it begins again serving the public interest instead of the mercantile interests of the pharmaceutical companies and the big polluters. So, I'm gonna shut up now, but I know how to fix this if I get in there. Your contributions to me are very, very critical. President Biden is going to spend $1 billion on this campaign. President Trump is going to spend $1 billion. I've only spent $15 million, and I'm already this far away from beating them both. I don't need a lot of money. I'll tell you what I need. I'm doing well in independents and people under 45. Why is that? One reason I'm talking to the youth, I'm the only one talking about how do you get these kids into homes? How do you protect their economy? But just as important, they get their news from podcasts, from long-form interviews. And so they're seeing long-form interviews from me, and they're watching me talk, and they know I care about them. The people I do worst with are baby boomers. Now, you'd think I'd do best with baby boomers, because they remember the Kennedy administration. They were alive during Camelot. But I do worse with them. Why? Because they get all their news from watching television, from CNN, NBC, ABC, MSNBC, and reading the New York Times and the Washington Post. And if I was living in that information bubble, I would have a very low opinion of myself. But what I need to do is what we find is, those networks will not allow me on to have an interview. They will talk about me. They will mischaracterize me. They will say, they'll say, tell people that I'm an anti-vaxxer, that I'm a conspiracy theorist, that I'm a wacko, that I'm anti-science. And what we find is that when we can get somebody from that generation to actually watch an interview, there's a very high conversion rate because they realize they've been lied to. And but the best way to do that is to buy advertising on those networks. And if we get enough money to do advertising, we're going to win this election walking away. A lot of the money that you gave me tonight is going to be used for two things. For ballot access. President Biden, President Trump get access to the ballot for free. I have to sign up 1 million signatures in 50 states. And that's going to cost about $15 million. So I need the money for that. And then I need the money for advertising. So I can get my message and my voice in front of those cohort, those baby boomers. Because if I get the baby boomers, I win the election. And I don't have to get all of them. I just need a little bit bigger percentage of them and I win. So I want to again thank Mike and Evelina for hosting this event and introducing me to all of their friends. And Sebastian, thank you for the part you played in this. And again, Archbishop, thank you for gracing us with your presence and your prayers. And thank you all for your generosity, for your support, and your friendship, which I treasure. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Oh, maybe Mike, if somebody asked the questions.
Steph.
Mr. Kennedy, if you become president, what are you going to do to tackle the rising incidences of crime in the major cities of our country?
It's a good question. You know, my father was the chief law enforcement official in this country. He had great compassion for people who were poor and in prison, but he also, one of the reasons he was able to unite both black and Hispanic voters as well as white working class people is because of his support for the police and his support for law enforcement. And I feel the same way. I feel you can't, you know, most of the victims of crime are poor and minority people, and that we need to protect everybody from crime in this country. And I'm going to have to make sure that we have strong law enforcement to do that. I'm going to end the chaos at the border, and I'm going to do that very quickly. And and I'm going to focus on getting people jobs, and and having zero tolerance for for the kind of chaos and crime that we're seeing in our cities right now.
Hello, Mr. Kennedy. I love your commitment to ending chronic disease and promoting health, but what specific policies and how will you as president prevent the tons of sugar in our diets, prevent the seed oils? What exact policies will you institute to decrease the amount of chronic disease? Because it's obviously caused by lack of exercise, horrible nutrition, and then with the increasing gap of rich and poor, the poor don't really have the access to the right foods.
Our children today are swimming around in a toxic soup. You know, a carrot 20 years ago has more nutrients in it than 8 carrots today. So you're eating we had nutrient-dense food and we had good food, high-quality food. Now we have the worst food in history. And that carrot is also contaminated with atrazine, with neonicotinoid pesticides, with glyphosate, and a lot of other chemicals. And those chemicals are in our water, they're in our air, but mainly they're in all of our foods, most of our foods, unless you're eating at Whole Foods, which most people can't afford. We're getting it from our medicines as well. In fact, you know, here's the curious thing. When EPA was asked by Congress, tell us what year the autism epidemic began, EPA came back and said it's a red line, 1989. We went from having, as I said, 1 in 10,000 Americans having autism to 1 in every 34, 1 in 22 boys. And nobody's asking, and all of these other chronic diseases began around the same time. Food allergies, autoimmune diseases, the obesity epidemic. When my uncle was president, 13% of children were obese. Today it's 42%, with 75% overweight. The children did not suddenly get lazy. We are mass poisoning them. Something is happening to them, and as you point out, part of it is sugar. I would say even worse than sugar are high fructose corn syrups, which, you know, is it has been linked scientifically to the diabetes and obesity epidemics. So NIH is supposed to answer those questions. Why aren't they? Why are we all sitting around and watching? Every classroom in this country now has EpiPens in it, and albuterol inhalers, and Adderall for our children. This was not true when I was a kid. What happened? Why is nobody asking, why do we have the sickest children in the world here in our country, the highest chronic disease burden in the world? NIH's job is to figure that out, particularly Anthony Fauci, because he was the head of the National Institute for Infectious and Allergic Diseases. Why isn't he telling us where these allergies came from? It all started in 1989. Now, there's a toxicologist called Phil Landrigan, who the most famous toxicologist. I've used him in a lot of my litigation. And he's done a series of studies saying what could be destroying our children's health. What is the cause? And he said, you follow that timeline, something happened in 1989. And he's come down to it with about 13 different possibilities. That's the entire universe. One of them is glyphosate, which is in Roundup. And that became ubiquitous at that time. Another one is PFOAs, forever chemicals, what we call also C8. And I've done a lot of litigation on those. There was a movie made about one of my cases called Dark Waters with Mark Ruffalo. And that is a flame retardant that was put in all of our children's pajamas and in all of our furniture around that era. Another is atrazine, which is another pesticide that's in 63% of our drinking water. Neonicotinoid pesticides, high fructose corn syrup, cell phone radiation. All of these things follow that. And then, of course, the vaccine schedule in 1989 was the big change year. We went from 3 vaccines that I got as a child to 72 vaccines now required for American kids. In California, you can't get out of it unless you lie. You cannot get out of it. Or homeschool your kids, and they're still under pressure, you know. So, and by the way, all of those diseases I listed, the autoimmune, neurological, allergic diseases, are all listed as side effects on the manufacturer's inserts inside of those products. So it has to be one of the suspects too, but it's probably an accumulation of all of these. They have a cumulative impact. Why don't we know the answer to that question? Because NIH won't study it. When I was a boy, I lived 10 minutes from Bethesda, Maryland, and I used to go visit NIH all the time. And NIH was the premier scientific organization, gold standard on earth. There are many nations that were starting there. 122 nations started after World War II. And a lot of those countries didn't have the money for scientific regulatory agencies for health. So they have in their constitution, whatever FDA says, whatever NIH says, that's what we go with in this country. Oh, it was globally respected. And they were doing first-class science. Since then, they do something else. They've now devolved, and there was a law that was changed in 1980 that said that NIH can make money on any product it develops for the pharmaceutical industry. It gets to keep 50% of the royalties. And individuals in NIH can also make $150,000 a year forever. So the Moderna vaccine, NIH owns half of it, made tens of billions of dollars, and 6 individuals at NIH are making $150,000 forever. They're paying for their mortgage, for their kids' education, for their boats, for their alimony, everything else. And that mercantile seduction subsumes the regulatory function of the agency. And now that agency does very little science that won't benefit the pharmaceutical industry. It's become the biggest incubator of new pharmaceutical products. So they're making products to treat the epidemic that they're causing. And the Adderall, the albuterol inhalers, all of that stuff, most of it came out of NIH. And I'm going to go to NIH my first week in office. And I'm going to bring in all the division chairs and the branch heads. I'm going to say, we're going to stop doing that for 8 years. And we're going to find out why our children are the sickest children in the world. And that's what we're going to focus on till we answer that question. Now, I'm going to add one thing. You can say to me, well, Bobby, even if you figured out that high fructose corn syrup was causing the diabetes epidemic and the obesity epidemic, what could you do about it? That industry is so powerful, they own Congress. The pharmaceutical and agricultural industries get whatever they want. So even if you knew that for a fact, you still couldn't. There are 1 million farmers who are making money on that industry that have been lured into it. They're forced to. There's giant companies like Cargill and Monsanto that are making that have billions invested in it. How can you ever attack companies of such power? Well, here's how. You do it by making sure that there's a lot of good science that makes the link. Once you have a critical threshold of 15 or 20 studies that, animal studies, bench studies, epidemiological studies, lawyers can then sue that company. There's Janet Nalbashian can tell you there's a threshold in the courts called the Daubert threshold, where if you say, that company caused my obesity, the judge is not allowed you to say that to the jury unless you can show that you have at least 15 or 20 studies that show that. You have to have a critical mass before you can go to a jury. That's what happened in the Monsanto case. We had a critical mass of study. We went to the jury. We had 40,000 cases, and we were trying them one at a time. The first one, we won 289 million. The second one, we won 89 million. The third one, we asked for 1 billion, and the jury gave us 2.2 billion. And Monsanto then came to the negotiating table, settled all the cases with us, and agreed to remove glyphosate from home gardening products. We can do that with all these exposures. We can do it one at a time by making sure there's enough science out there that lawyers can then go bring these companies to court, and then you don't need to change the regulations because the company doesn't want to go bankrupt. So it's going to stop making those products and find a safe way to do the same thing.
We have time for one more question.
First off, I'd like to say thank you so much from myself and certainly from everybody here for taking this time out of your life to take this wonderful campaign and give us all inspiration for help for the future. I have a question. I hope I can explain it clearly, but it's something that I find very, very dear to me, and I think a lot of people do, and with respect to just, the love for our country. What do you anticipate doing when you become president to deal with what appears to be the sort of the capricious lawlessness and lying under oath and three-letter agencies violating the Constitution? What can be done about that if you were president? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and I've given it a lot of thought. The first thing I'm going to do is the day I get into office, I'm going to issue an executive order forbidding any federal employee from colluding with the press or the social media to censor political speech among Americans. That same day, I'm going to pardon Julian Assange and Edwin Snowden as a civics lesson for the American public about, people who tell us who are whistleblowers should be honored. They shouldn't be punished and jailed in silence. And then, I have longer term plans for the intelligence agencies. The CIA has 27,000 people who work for it, and most of those people are patriotic Americans who are very, very good public servants. The people at the top of the agency, not so much. The people who run the branches and the division chairs. In fact, I had dinner with Mike Pompeo about 3 months ago. I'd never met him before, and I was invited to this very small dinner in Las Vegas, and he was my table mate. And I began talking to him, and he was very, very frank. And of course, he had been Secretary of State. Before that, he was director of the CIA. And he said to me, without any prompting from me, he said, the worst mistake I made was that I did not clean up the institutional culture and corruption at the CIA. And he added this, he said, the entire upper echelon of that agency is made up of people who do not believe in the democratic institutions of American democracy. That was his statement. Now, the person who's running my campaign is Amaryllis Fox. She's my daughter-in-law, and she's married to my son, Bobby. And she spent her entire career in the clandestine services of the CIA. Oh, she was in the weapons of mass destruction program. She was stationed in Pakistan and China. And she understands the agency. And she spent the 15 years that she's been out of the agency fighting against the war machine and her old bosses at CIA. And she's one of the most brilliant people I know. And we talk about how to reform the agency all the time. But we have a blueprint because my uncle drew up that blueprint just before he died. And my father, 2 weeks before he died, had a conversation with Pete Hamill in California, the reporter, where Hamill said, what are you going to do with the CIA? And my father said, I'm going to separate the plans division, which is the dirty tricks, is the paramilitary division, and it's the division that does the fixed elections, assassinates foreign leaders, gets us into wars, does regime change, all that. He said, I'm going to make them a separate agency from the espionage division. The espionage division is where we have these immensely talented people. Espionage is spying, it's information gathering and analysis. And we have extraordinary people who work in that agency, but as long as the two of them are wed to each other, the espionage division covers up and serves as the kind of the extension of the plans division, and it corrupts it. So I will separate those divisions of the agency and have the espionage division, rather than justifying what the plans division does, actually look over its shoulder and look at the costs of blowback. Look at, make sure there's accountability. Make sure that when the CIA makes mistakes that we know about them and that the public knows about them. And, I think that is ambitious, but it's something that I've been thinking of for many, many years, and that I intend to do. Mike, thank you, and thank you.
Let's take, Bobby, let's take one or two issues related to Armenian Americans.
So, Mr. Kennedy, my name is Armin Hovhannissian. I'm back in the back of the room. Thank you for being here. What you see around you here is a history of the Armenian American community that dates back more than 100 years, and as recently as 5 or 6 years. All of our families having come from historic Armenia, Eastern Turkey, and then more recently from Armenia and from the Middle East.
And from Lebanon.
And from Lebanon, as Mr. Sarian and his wife, or is not his wife, but Mr. Sarian. So what we have heard tonight, we totally connect to. We are parents, we are grandparents, and we've had parents and grandparents in this country. We are Americans through and through. We've paid our dues, and it's our privilege to be Americans. But we are in this hall tonight as Subrevolence Church because we are Armenians. That's why we are here tonight. And so, as much as everything else connects to us, which it does, we need your voice to redound again and to reassure again that after so many administrations, the boogeyman was not to recognize the Armenian genocide because of the pressure of the Republic of Turkey. President Joe Biden, 3 years ago, tried to put a Band-Aid on it. That Band-Aid did not hold. A genocide then ensued in the Republic of Artsakh, as you put out so eloquently. And so what we want to know, not what I want to know, what my children at home want to know, and they couldn't be here tonight, and my wife, who couldn't be here tonight, is what are we going to do for more than 100,000, not even indigenous, forever Armenians who were in the land of Artsakh? Not what can we do, what will you do, Mr. Kennedy? Thank you.
I mean, as I said, and I'm going to use the leverage of the presidency, both the bully pulpit, to talk about this issue, which has not been talked about, that the world doesn't know about this issue. Everybody knows about Israel and Gaza. You had an ethnic cleansing that was momentous, that expelled the entire population. Beginning in September, over 120,000 people with cluster bombing going on for 2.5 years preceding that. And, which is illegal. And nobody said anything. And I'm going to say it, and I'm going to remind people of it and talk a lot about it. The other thing is we have leverage in that region. Turkey, we have leverage over Turkey. We have leverage over Azerbaijan because our oil industry is so active there. And I intend to improve our relationships with Russia. And this will be part of the things that part of the menu of items that I talk about with Russia. I will make this a priority for my administration, and I'll also tell you, Armand and Mike and the other people who are there, that you have my telephone number, my cell phone number. And when I get in there, I want to hear from you. And I want you to come in and meet with the State Department. And I will assign somebody in the State Department to do nothing but think about Armenia and look for leverage points that we can use as the United States to get those 120,000 Armenians back in their empty country. Right? Azerbaijan didn't even move in there. The churches are standing there. The nation is still standing there. And, I will do everything in my power to peacefully restore sovereignty, Armenian sovereignty over Artsakh.
last question. Anybody wants to be the last question? So we'll make
Hello?
So be the two
Sorry.
last ones.
Okay, I'll.
Go ahead.
Me
No,
or?
go ahead.
Go ahead, please.
Hold up.
Yeah.
A few people here have asked me if we're going to see you on a debate stage, and I think you can answer that best. Quick question.
The question is, will I be on a debate stage? The answer is, if they debate, I'll be on the stage. They have to live, they've already scheduled 3 debates. And anybody who has over 15% of the vote is entitled to be on the debate stage. So that would just be me, President Biden, and President Trump. So if they... I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know whether President Biden will actually be willing to debate. But if he does, I should be on the debate stage. Oh, and thank you for the question.
What was the last question?
Sir.
Thank you. First of all, I want to say thank you for your remarks and statements in support of Artsakh in Armenia. And as an Armenian reporter, I have a question regarding Artsakh. There is a major opinion among Armenians, and not only Armenians, but also others, think that the most powerful countries in the world are complicit in genocide that happened in Artsakh. They could have done a lot of stuff to prevent the genocide and ethnic cleansing, but they didn't do anything. So do you agree with this opinion? And also, if so, is it because, let's say, American government is controlled by big corporations, or they are far away from the democracy, humanitarian rights, independence, like human rights and other things? And if I may ask another question, what do you stand for foreign policies? There are presidents that have like very active, I would say like pro-war policies. Let's say Obama, Clinton's, George Bush, now Biden. And there are like candidates, they are against those policies. They name it regime change policies. And they said it's time to stop it and bring the money back to the country and spend on infrastructures. And that's the second question. Where do you stand in foreign policies? Thank you so much.
In answer to your first question, I can't answer why that happened. What I can say to you is that I don't think that it happened completely by, I don't think it was just an invasion by Azerbaijan. I think that we have ways of pressuring them, and I think that this was in the interests of the oil industry, and it was in the interests of other geopolitical powerhouses in the region, including, Turkey, that we have this very complicated relationship with. So I cannot tell you exactly why that happened, but I don't think it's as simple as even the bare bones issues that were reported. And I know you've done research on the past history and look at classified documents from the U.S., from Russia, and from other nations, and those classified documents show clearly that there is manipulation and maneuvering and complicity by very, very powerful nations and national governments and oil interests in what happens in that region. So, I can't tell you exactly the details, but I think that your suspicion it aligns with my own. In terms of war, one of my central planks as president is to unravel the war machine. We have 800 bases abroad right now. Russia has won in Syria. The Chinese have 1.5. And each one of those bases is picking a fight with somebody. And the function of the intelligence agencies, as my uncle came to understand very quickly within 4 months of taking office, is to provide the military-industrial complex with a constant pipeline of new wars. And you look who's profiteering on the Ukraine war, for example, and it's the same companies, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, which own McDonnell Douglas, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed. And why do we need to expand NATO into every one of these nations? Because when we expand NATO into 15 nations, that nation has to conform its weapons purchases to NATO specifications. It immediately means billions of dollars for those 5 companies. And those companies are the biggest donors to both the Democratic and Republican parties. So I think the game is rigged, and Americans we're seduced constantly by these comic book depictions that this man is a supervillain, we gotta go to war against him. And they control propaganda in our country, and they control the press, and just look at what do we do with $8 trillion? $8 trillion that we spent on Iraq and all the aftermath wars. In Syria, Libya, Yemen, and that came after Iraq. What happened to all that money? Here's what we got for $8 trillion. Iraq is now worse off than we found it. It is incoherent as a nation. It's just a war between Shia and Sunni Muslims. And it is now a proxy for Iran, which is the worst possible outcome that we could have had for the region. The reason for the Hamas invasion in Israel is because Iran did not want to see the Solomon Accords, the peace agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and that was about to be signed. And that was what triggered this invasion, just a hostility to peace. And Iraq used to counterbalance Iran in the region. And now there's no counterbalance. And Iran has got, 7 or 8 proxy armies. It has Hezbollah in Lebanon. It has Islamic Jihad in the West Bank. It has Hamas in Gaza. It has the Houthi army in Yemen, and it now controls 30% of the shipping in the world through the Suez Canal. The Suez has 2 choke points, and one of them is the Yemen Peninsula, and the other is Suez. And that 30% of the world's shipping goes through that, and it's now shut down. The only nation that is allowed today to ship through the Suez because of the Houthis is China. So China's tankers are going through every day, and it makes every product in China much cheaper than any other country, because now every other country has to go around the Horn of Africa. The Syrian war, which was a spillover from we created ISIS. We did that with the Iraq war. ISIS was the army that we disarmed, the Iraqi army. And then they went into Syria to overthrow that government. And we drove 2 million refugees into Europe. It destabilized every democracy in Europe for the next 2 or 3 generations. The Brexit is a direct result of the Syrian conflict and refugee crisis. What's happening today in France, the riots in France, are a direct result of the Houthi crisis, or the Syrian crisis. And now we've created BRICS because of our wars in the region, which is threatening the role of the US dollar as the global reserve currency. And if we lose that, it's trillions of dollars in cost to our country. And nobody wanted to create bricks. We forced them to with these military adventures abroad. So that's what we got for $8 trillion. And to me, as president, I'm going to end that. And I'm going to bring that money home. I'm going to rebuild our industrial base in this country. I thank you all very, very much.
If you'd like to make a contribution tonight.
Thank you so much for coming. Appreciate it. Thank you, Bobby, for a wonderful speech.
If you'd like to make a contribution tonight, there is a